For years, Steven Seagal wasn't treated like a normal movie star. He was treated like a warning. The story surrounding him was simple and terrifying at the same time. He wasn't acting. He wasn't pretending. He was presented as a real killer who just happened to make movies. An ex-elite operative. A man with a past so dangerous it could never be fully explained on screen. Hollywood sold that idea, fans believed it, and Steven Seagal never rushed to correct it. But there was a problem. When people eventually started asking real questions, the answers didn't exist. Records didn't back up the stories. Claims didn't match reality. And once the illusion cracked, it didn't crack quietly. It started to collapse in public. What followed wasn't one scandal or one bad film, but a slow chain reaction, lawsuits, accusations, ridicule, exile from Hollywood, and a career that faded into something almost unrecognizable. Steven Seagal wasn't destroyed by lack of talent or box office failure. He was destroyed by the very lie that made him famous. Steven Seagal was born in 1952, Michigan, and raised largely in California. Unlike the image later attached to him, his early life showed no sign of secret military training or intelligence work. What did stand out was his early interest in martial arts. In his late teens and early 20s, Seagal traveled to Japan, where he studied Aikido extensively. This part of his story is real and verifiable. He became deeply involved in the discipline, trained under respected teachers, and eventually ran an Aikido dojo. Over time, he built a genuine reputation in Aikido circles, even becoming one of the first foreigners to operate such a dojo in Japan. That background, combined with his confidence and physical presence, became the foundation for a much larger myth. When Seagal returned to the United States, he positioned himself not just as a martial artist, but as a man with dangerous knowledge. He worked as an Aikido instructor and moved in law enforcement and Hollywood-adjacent circles. The transition to film was sudden. In 1988, Warner Brothers built Above the Law around him from the ground up. The film didn't just introduce Seagal. It introduced a persona. His character was an ex-CIA operative turned cop, fluent in martial arts, morally rigid, and unstoppable. It wasn't subtle. The movie asked audiences to believe that Seagal wasn't learning to play this role, he was revealing who he already was. That formula continued. Hard to Kill, Marked for Death, and Out for Justice followed quickly. Each film reinforced the same message. Seagal's characters were former military, intelligence, or special forces. They didn't crack jokes. They didn't panic. They moved slowly, destroyed enemies efficiently, and spoke with authority about violence and justice. By the time Under Siege arrived in 1992, the myth was complete. Seagal played Casey Ryback, an ex-Navy SEAL turned cook, a role that became his biggest box office success. The marketing leaned into realism. This wasn't fantasy violence. This was how it would really happen. Off-screen, the same image was quietly encouraged. Interviews were vague but suggestive. Stories circulated about Seagal having worked with intelligence agencies or law enforcement in highly classified capacities. No details were ever provided, but they didn't need to be. The silence itself helped the image. Fans filled in the gaps. Seagal didn't deny it. And Hollywood, sensing that this aura was his biggest asset, had no reason to dig deeper. At his peak, Steven Seagal wasn't selling movies. He was selling authenticity. But underneath the carefully cultivated image was a growing problem. The more Seagal leaned on the idea that he was essentially one of his on-screen characters, the more fragile his reputation became. His behavior on sets began drawing attention. He developed a reputation for being difficult, inflexible, and controlling. Stories circulated about him injuring stunt performers by refusing to pull strikes during rehearsals. One widely repeated incident involved legendary stuntman Gene LaBelle, who reportedly humbled Seagal during a training dispute. Whether every version of that story was true or not, the damage was real. For the first time, cracks appeared in the image of the untouchable warrior. Public perception continued to shift in the early 1990s. His guest hosting appearance on Saturday Night Live became infamous, not for comedy, but for how badly it went. Accounts from cast members later described Seagal as humorless, arrogant, and dismissive of the show's format. Lorne Michaels would later publicly label him one of the worst hosts in the show's history. That moment mattered more than it seemed. It hinted that Steven Seagal didn't understand collaboration or self-awareness, two things Hollywood tolerates only when box office numbers stay strong. By the mid-1990s, Seagal's films began declining commercially and critically. On Deadly Ground, which he directed, was widely criticized and marked a turning point. Audiences were changing. Action heroes were becoming more self-aware, more charismatic, or more grounded. Seagal's rigid, humorless persona began feeling outdated. Yet he didn't evolve. Instead, he doubled down on the same myth. He was still playing elite operatives, still invincible, still untouchable, but now fewer people were buying tickets to see it. What made the decline worse was that questions about his past were no longer whispers. Journalists, critics, and later the public began pointing out something simple but devastating. There was no record of Steven Seagal ever serving in the military. No Navy SEAL background. No verified government service. The foundation of the image he'd built his career on was evaporating. And once that illusion weakened, everything attached to it began to fall with it. As the illusion weakened, the gap between Steven Seagal's on-screen persona and his real-world reputation became impossible to ignore. What had once been marketed as quiet intensity started looking like rigidity and ego. Directors, producers, and co-stars increasingly described him as difficult to work with, unwilling to take direction, and disconnected from the collaborative nature of filmmaking. In an industry that tolerated bad behavior only as long as profits justified it, Seagal's declining box office power made those traits a liability. By the late 1990s, major studios were no longer eager to build films around him. At the same time, allegations began to surface that darkened his image far beyond questions of ego or professionalism. As early as the 1990s, women working in and around the entertainment industry accused Seagal of sexual harassment and coercive behavior. Several actresses later stated that meetings framed as auditions or rehearsals turned into unwanted advances. These claims did not immediately end his career, partly because Hollywood at the time routinely protected powerful men, and partly because Seagal's star had already started fading from the mainstream spotlight. The pattern continued into the 2000s. In 2010, Seagal was sued by a former assistant who accused him of sexual harassment, sex trafficking, and other misconduct. While the lawsuit was eventually dropped, his reality show Steven Seagal Lawman was quietly suspended soon after. The damage to his reputation was already done. During the Me Too movement years later, multiple women publicly accused Seagal of rape or sexual assault, including well-known actresses. Prosecutors reviewed at least one case but declined to file charges, largely due to expired statutes of limitations. Crucially, the lack of charges did not restore his image. Instead, these stories reinforced the idea that the disciplined, honorable warrior persona had little connection to reality. As studios distanced themselves, Seagal's career slid almost entirely into direct-to-video territory. Once a box office draw, he became a low-budget fixture, often appearing overweight, barely moving during fight scenes, sitting through conversations, or letting body doubles handle action sequences. These films kept his name alive on streaming platforms and bargain DVD shelves, but they erased any remaining prestige. The same man once sold as unstoppable was now being mocked for looking disengaged in his own movies. Instead of attempting a Hollywood rehabilitation, Seagal took a different path. Over the next decade, he aligned himself increasingly with Russia. In 2016, he was granted Russian citizenship. In 2018, he was appointed a special representative to improve U.S.-Russia humanitarian ties. Publicly, he became a vocal supporter of Vladimir Putin, praising him repeatedly and appearing alongside him at official events. For Western audiences, this decision marked a symbolic point of no return. Whatever remained of Seagal's action hero legacy was now overshadowed by his political alignment. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Seagal did not retreat into silence. He repeated Kremlin-aligned talking points and appeared in Russian state media environments. In 2023, he was awarded Russia's Order of Friendship. To many Western viewers, he was no longer a forgotten action star, but a controversial figure openly supporting an authoritarian regime during wartime. That association ensured his chances of any meaningful Hollywood return were effectively over. Legal and financial issues further eroded what remained of his public standing. In 2020, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission charged Seagal with failing to disclose payments he received for promoting a cryptocurrency. He agreed to pay penalties but later faced court action for unpaid amounts. This episode reinforced the growing narrative that the image of wisdom, honor, and discipline he projected had repeatedly clashed with his actual decisions. By the early 2020s, Steven Seagal's transformation was complete. He was no longer an American action star who fell from grace. He had become a figure operating almost entirely outside the Hollywood system that made him famous. He continued to appear in obscure films, public events, and political ceremonies, but the cultural power he once held was gone. Younger audiences knew him more as a meme than a movie star. Older audiences remembered him as someone whose career ended badly. Yet the most damaging part of his downfall wasn't scandal alone. Hollywood has weathered scandals many times before. The real issue was that Steven Seagal's brand depended entirely on one idea: authenticity. Once people questioned whether he was truly who he claimed to be, the entire structure collapsed. His characters only worked if audiences believed he could actually live those roles. When that belief disappeared, there was nothing left to protect. Steven Seagal didn't adapt, didn't apologize publicly in a meaningful way, and didn't separate his persona from his personal behavior. Instead, he leaned further into defiance and isolation. In doing so, he confirmed what critics had already begun to believe. The myth had been more important to him than reality. And once reality pushed back, the myth didn't survive. This wasn't a fall caused by aging or changing trends alone. Many action stars aged out gracefully by reinventing themselves. Seagal never did. He doubled down on the same identity long after the world had stopped believing in it. And by the time the lie fully collapsed, there was no place left for him in the industry that once built him into a legend. By the time Steven Seagal reached his late 60s, the contrast between who he once was and who he had become was impossible to ignore. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, his presence had symbolized control, menace, and authority. Now, that image existed only in old movie posters and recycled clips online. The industry that once designed films around his identity no longer needed him. And more importantly, it no longer believed in him. What makes Seagal's downfall unique is that it wasn't caused by a single catastrophic event. There was no one moment where everything collapsed. Instead, it was erosion. Every time a claim went unverified, every time a story contradicted documented reality, every time another allegation surfaced, the ground beneath his career weakened further. The lie didn't destroy him overnight. It destroyed him slowly. By making every flaw impossible to ignore, Steven Seagal's action persona demanded absolute credibility. His characters didn't rely on charm or humor. They relied on the audience believing that he could actually do this. That belief is fragile. Once audiences began seeing him less as a disciplined master and more as an inflated personality protected by myth, the magic disappeared. Unlike other action stars, Seagal had no fallback persona. He didn't reinvent himself as a character actor. He didn't lean into self-parody. He didn't pivot toward mentorship roles or prestige television. His identity had been built too narrowly. Hollywood has forgiven far worse behavior when the product still sells. The problem for Seagal was that once the illusion broke, his films stopped selling. Without ticket sales or critical support, there was no incentive to protect him. Studios don't abandon stars because of morality alone. They abandon stars when belief disappears. And belief was the only currency Seagal ever truly had. As public attention turned elsewhere, Seagal continued to insist on his own legend. Instead of downscaling the myth, he amplified it. He surrounded himself with sympathetic platforms, avoided critical scrutiny, and embraced environments where his image wouldn't be challenged. His relocation toward Russia and public support of authoritarian leadership weren't just political choices, they were symbolic. He chose spaces where his version of reality could exist unopposed. For many viewers, this sealed his reputation permanently. The man who once stood against fictional terrorists and criminals now aligned himself with real-world power structures that alienated his original audience. Any remaining nostalgia was overtaken by discomfort. Whatever sympathy people might have had for a fallen star faded as he actively reinforced the worst perceptions about himself. In retrospect, Steven Seagal's story is not really about martial arts, Hollywood, politics, or even misconduct allegations in isolation. It's about image dependency. His career depended entirely on one assumption: that the man on screen and the man off screen were fundamentally the same. When that assumption stopped being believable, his career had nothing left to stand on. Many action stars outgrow their primes and remain respected because their stardom was built on range, adaptability, or charisma. Seagal's was built on infallibility, and infallibility cannot survive scrutiny. Once people started asking basic questions, the myth that protected him turned into the very thing that exposed him. Today, Steven Seagal exists largely outside the cultural conversation that once celebrated him. His films no longer define genres, his name no longer opens doors. Younger audiences know him as a controversial figure rather than a cinematic icon. Older audiences remember him as someone who could have evolved, but chose defiance instead. The lie that destroyed Steven Seagal wasn't a single false statement. It was the decision to let fiction become identity. It was allowing a marketing persona to replace accountability. It was believing that silence and suggestion could carry a career forever. Hollywood can sell many illusions, but only temporarily. Eventually, reality arrives. And when it does, it doesn't negotiate. Steven Seagal didn't lose his career because the world changed. He lost it because the truth caught up.